They said I died in a car accident last Tuesday, and my wife looked devastated at my funeral when she brought her close friend Mark for emotional support, but what she didn't know was that I was sitting in the back row watching everything unfold right in front of my eyes. When I saw her whisper to him that just 3 more hours until the life insurance clears, I realized my wife wasn't mourning my death at all, she was celebrating it, but Sarah had no idea that I'd recorded every single word she said, and her perfect plan was about to become her worst nightmare. My name is David, and 3 weeks ago I was supposed to die. So let me take you back to where this all started because you need to understand how a 15-year marriage can turn into a murder plot. Sarah and I met in college when we were both 21 years old. She was studying literature and I was in computer science, and she had this laugh that could light up an entire room, and when she looked at me I felt like I was the only person in the world who mattered to her. We got married 2 years later in a small ceremony with just our closest friends and family, and for 15 years I genuinely thought we were happy together. I built a software company from absolutely nothing, working 80-hour weeks and missing birthdays and anniversaries, but I kept telling myself that I was doing it all for us and for our future together. Last year I finally sold my company for $8 million, but Sarah didn't know the exact amount because I told her it was around $2 million since I wanted to surprise her later with her dream house or maybe take her to Italy like she'd always wanted. I thought I was being romantic and thoughtful, but it turns out I was just being stupid and naive about what was really going on behind my back. After the sale went through I finally had time to focus on us and be the husband I should have been all along, but something felt off because Sarah seemed distant and distracted all the time. She'd smile at her phone and quickly lock the screen whenever I walked into the room, and she started going to the gym 5 times a week when she'd barely gone once a month before, plus she bought new clothes and started wearing a different perfume that I didn't recognize. She said she was just taking care of herself and wanted to feel good about her appearance, and I believed her because I'm an idiot who desperately wanted to believe that everything was fine in our marriage. Then one morning over coffee Sarah casually brought up the topic of life insurance, saying that we should increase my policy now that the company had sold and we needed to protect our assets for the future. It made perfect sense to me since I was worth more now than I'd ever been, so I agreed without hesitation and we increased the policy to $5 million. Sarah handled all the paperwork because she was always better with documents and legal stuff anyway, and I just signed where she told me to sign without thinking twice about what I was actually agreeing to, which was probably the biggest mistake of my entire life. That was 6 months ago, and during those 6 months things only got worse between us even though I couldn't quite put my finger on what was wrong. She'd come home late from work almost every night and always had a convenient excuse ready, whether it was a work dinner or girls' night out or her sister needing help with something. I started noticing little things that didn't add up, like receipts for restaurants I'd never been to with her and charges on our credit card for hotels right here in our own city, and I kept asking myself who needs a hotel in their own city unless they're hiding something they don't want their spouse to know about. I'm not proud of what I did next, but I installed a tracking app on her phone and told myself I was just being paranoid and that I'd find nothing and feel guilty about invading her privacy and delete the whole thing. But I didn't find nothing at all. In fact, I found everything I needed to know about what my wife was really doing with her time. She was meeting someone regularly, every Tuesday and Thursday like clockwork at the same hotel at the same time, and for 3 solid months she'd been going to the Riverside Inn at 2 in the afternoon. I sat in my car outside that hotel for 2 hours trying to decide what to do next, and part of me wanted to burst through the door and confront them both right there, but something stopped me because some instinct told me to wait and watch and learn more before I made any moves. So I hired a private investigator named Richard who was a former cop running his own agency, and I gave him everything I had including the tracker data and the receipts and the hotel name. He said he'd have answers for me in about a week, but it only took him 3 days to get everything he needed to completely destroy my world. Richard called me on a Friday afternoon and his voice was dead serious when he said we needed to meet in person because this wasn't something he could discuss over the phone, and I knew right then that it was bad, probably worse than I'd even imagined. I met him at a coffee shop downtown and he slid a manila envelope across the table while saying he was sorry, and I knew in that moment that my marriage was completely over. Inside the envelope were dozens of photos showing Sarah with a man I'd never seen before in my life, kissing in the hotel parking lot and holding hands at a restaurant and walking together like a real couple. But what absolutely destroyed me was the last photo in the stack, which showed Sarah and this man coming out of a jewelry store while he was putting a ring on her finger, and it wasn't a wedding ring or an anniversary gift, it was an engagement ring because my wife was engaged to another man while still legally married to me. I couldn't breathe properly and Richard kept talking but I couldn't hear anything he was saying because everything sounded like I was underwater and drowning. Finally his words broke through the fog in my brain when he said there's more you need to see, and he showed me bank statements that made my stomach turn. Sarah had opened a secret account that I knew nothing about, and she'd been systematically moving money out of our joint accounts, starting with small amounts like $500 here and $1,000 there so I wouldn't notice the pattern. Over the course of 2 years she'd moved almost $300,000 of my money I'd earned and trusted her to help manage, into this secret account that only she had access to. But the worst part, the absolute worst part that made me want to throw up right there in the coffee shop, was when Richard showed me the text messages he'd managed to access from her phone records. The messages were between Sarah and this man whose name turned out to be Mark, and they weren't just having a casual affair or planning to run away together, they were actually planning to murder me and make it look like an accident. I'm not exaggerating or being dramatic, they were literally discussing different methods to kill me so they could collect the $5 million life insurance policy and start their new life together without me in the way. The messages were careful and somewhat coded but clear enough that anyone reading them would understand exactly what they meant. Mark wrote that the insurance policy had come through and $5 million was enough to start over somewhere new, and Sarah replied that they just needed to be patient and wait for the right opportunity because I couldn't suspect anything was wrong. Another message from Mark asked about staging an accident since those happen all the time and nobody really questions them, and Sarah's response made me physically sick to my stomach when I read it. She wrote that I drive the same mountain road every Sunday morning and it has sharp turns with no guardrails, and one mistake would send the car right over the edge. Mark replied saying he could make it look completely natural because he'd done this kind of thing before, which suggested this wasn't his first time planning a murder. I sat in that coffee shop reading detailed messages about my own murder, messages from the woman I'd loved for 17 years and built an entire life with, and I realized she didn't love me at all and probably never had. I was just a paycheck to her, a life insurance policy walking around, a problem that needed to be solved so she could move on to her next chapter. Richard asked me what I wanted to do and the obvious answer was to call the police immediately, but I said no because an idea was forming in my head. It was a crazy and dangerous and probably illegal idea, but I didn't care about any of that anymore because I was done playing by the rules with people who wanted me dead. If Sarah wanted me dead so badly then I'd give her exactly what she wanted, I'd die right on schedule, and then I'd sit back and watch what happened next when she thought she'd finally won. I told Richard my plan and he thought I was absolutely insane, asking what would happen if something went wrong and I actually got hurt, but I didn't care about the danger anymore. I cared about the truth, the complete unfiltered truth about who my wife really was and how far she was willing to go. I needed to see her reaction when she thought I was dead, I needed to hear what she'd say when she thought nobody was listening, and I needed evidence so overwhelming that she could never talk her way out of what she'd done. So Richard and I spent the next few days planning every single detail of my fake death, working out every possible contingency and making sure nothing could go wrong. The next Sunday morning I drove my usual route up the mountain just like I did every week, taking the steep winding road with the beautiful views that I'd driven 1,000 times before. But this time I wasn't alone because Richard was following me in an unmarked car at a safe distance, and Mark was already up there waiting for his opportunity to strike. I saw his truck parked at a scenic overlook pretending to admire the view, but I knew exactly why he was really there and what he was planning to do. I drove past him slowly and went around the next curve to a spot that Richard and I had carefully chosen earlier in the week. It was perfect for what we needed because it had a sharp turn and a steep drop and no witnesses anywhere for miles around. I got out of my car and walked to the edge of the cliff, taking photos of the valley below like I was just a tourist enjoying the scenery, and then I waited for Mark to make his move. 5 minutes later I heard his truck approaching from behind, and he slowed down when he saw my car sitting there empty. I could see him through his windshield calculating and planning and deciding if this was finally his moment to go through with the plan. He made his decision and suddenly accelerated straight toward my parked car, clearly intending to push it over the edge with me supposedly inside. But I wasn't inside because I was already hidden in the trees with Richard, and we both watched as Mark's truck slammed into my car with tremendous force. The impact sent my car rolling down the mountainside, crashing through trees and undergrowth while metal screamed and glass shattered everywhere, and it exploded into a massive fireball when it finally hit the bottom of the ravine. Mark sat in his truck for a long moment making sure nobody had seen what just happened, then he carefully backed up and checked his vehicle for damage before simply driving away like nothing had happened, like he hadn't just tried to murder someone in cold blood. Richard got every single second on video including Mark's face and his license plate and the deliberate impact and everything we needed to prove this was intentional. We called it in anonymously saying we'd seen a car go over the edge, and by the time emergency services arrived at the scene we were already long gone. The car had burned so intensely hot that they couldn't identify any remains, and they assumed I'd been completely incinerated in the explosion. My dental records were on file but with no actual remains to check against them, They declared me legally dead based purely on circumstantial evidence like my car and my wallet that I'd deliberately left at the scene and witnesses who'd seen me driving that morning. Sarah got the call from the police that evening telling her I was dead, and I wasn't there to see her reaction, but Richard had someone watching the house with surveillance equipment. He told me later that she screamed and collapsed on the floor and cried hysterically for over an hour, putting on an absolutely brilliant performance that would have won her an Academy Award. She immediately called Mark and he rushed right over to comfort her, holding her while she sobbed about her dead husband and how much she'd loved me and how she couldn't believe I was gone. I watched the surveillance footage later that night and it made me physically sick to see her fake tears and manufactured grief. The funeral was scheduled for the following Friday, exactly 5 days after my supposed death, which gave Sarah 5 full days to play the grieving widow for everyone around her. She posted heartbreaking messages on social media about her devastating loss and how she didn't know how to go on without me, and friends and family flooded her posts with condolences and comments about how strong and brave she was being. If only they knew the truth about what she'd really been planning and what she was really thinking behind that mask of grief. I spent those 5 days holed up in a hotel room while Richard brought me food and newspapers that featured my obituary on the pages. It was completely surreal reading about your own death and seeing people comment on your life and realizing how little any of them actually knew the real you. My colleagues from work said I was driven and brilliant in their statements, my neighbor said I was quiet and kept to myself, and Sarah told reporters I was the love of her life and her soulmate. Every single one of them was wrong about who I really was, but I guess that's what happens when you spend your whole life working instead of actually connecting with people. The day of the funeral finally arrived and Richard helped me put together a convincing disguise that would let me attend without being recognized. We added a gray beard and changed my haircut completely and gave me thick glasses and even practiced a limp to change the way I walked. When we were done I looked like a completely different person, someone who could sit in that funeral home without anyone having the slightest idea who I really was. We arrived early and I took a seat in the very back row, far away from everyone else, just another mourner who'd come to pay their respects to the deceased. The funeral home was absolutely packed with people and I had no idea I knew this many individuals or that this many people would actually show up for me. There were colleagues and clients and old friends I hadn't seen in years, and sitting right there in the front row was Sarah wearing a black dress with a veil and clutching tissues in her hand. Mark sat beside her with his hand on her shoulder in what everyone probably thought was just friendly support, but I knew the truth about their relationship and what they'd done together. Nobody else in that room had any idea they were looking at two murderers who thought they'd gotten away with it. The service started and my brother gave a eulogy about our childhood, talking about how I always wanted to build things even when I was just a little kid taking apart radios and computers. He cried real genuine tears while talking about me and I almost broke down right there seeing him hurt so badly, but I forced myself to stay quiet and stay hidden because this wasn't over yet and I needed to see it through to the end. Then Sarah stood up to give her own eulogy and she walked to the podium slowly like every step was painful, taking a shaking breath before she began speaking to the crowd. She said that I was her everything, her best friend and partner and soulmate, and that we'd built such a beautiful life together that was now gone forever. She went on about how she didn't know how to exist in a world without me and how empty everything felt now, pausing dramatically to wipe her eyes while the entire room sat in absolute silence except for people quietly crying. I wanted to scream and jump up and expose her right there in front of everyone, but I didn't because this was just the beginning of what I had planned and I needed more evidence of who she really was. Sarah continued her performance saying that I'd worked so hard for us and sacrificed so much and she'd taken all of that for granted when I was alive. She said she wished she could tell me one more time how much she loved me and how proud she was of everything I'd accomplished, but now she'd never get that chance and she'd carry that regret with her forever. More tears flowed and more tissues came out and people lined up after to hug her and tell her how strong she was being, while Mark stayed close to her the entire time with his hands constantly touching her shoulder or her hand or her back. They were possessive touches that showed ownership, like she already belonged to him and I was already forgotten and erased from her life. After the service ended there was a reception at our house because Sarah had arranged everything perfectly, with food and drinks and photos of me displayed everywhere like it was a celebration of my life. Except my wife was actually celebrating my death and her freedom and her upcoming fortune. I didn't go to the reception because it was too risky that someone might recognize me despite the disguise, but Richard went and wore a wire that recorded every conversation. People started leaving around 8 o'clock and by 9 o'clock only Mark remained at the house with Sarah, and that's when they finally dropped their act completely. I listened to the recording later that night and Sarah's voice sounded tired but incredibly relieved when she said it's finally over and we did it. Mark agreed enthusiastically and mentioned that $5 million would hit the account in just 3 days once the death certificate was fully processed, and then they'd be completely free to start their new life together. They talked about their detailed plans to move to Costa Rica and buy a house right on the beach and start over in a place where nobody knew them or their past. Sarah actually laughed out loud, genuinely laughed, and said she couldn't believe how easy the whole thing had been and how she'd played the grieving widow perfectly. Mark told her she deserved an Oscar for her performance and they should celebrate properly, so they made a toast using my expensive whiskey, raising their glasses to new beginnings and freedom and getting away with murder. But they didn't get away with anything because I was already planning the second phase of my revenge, and this time I wasn't going to hold back or show any mercy. I died exactly like they wanted. I'd attended my own funeral and watched them celebrate, and now it was time to come back from the dead, but I needed to wait until I had absolutely everything I needed to bury them both. Over the next week, Richard and I worked around the clock compiling every single piece of evidence we had against them. We had the surveillance footage of Mark deliberately ramming my car off the cliff. We had all the text messages where they planned my murder in detail. We had the financial records showing Sarah had been stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars. We had audio of her fake grief at the funeral, and we had the recording of them celebrating and toasting to getting away with murder. We had everything we needed and then some, and 1 week after my funeral I finally made my move. I called the police station and told them I needed to report a serious crime, and when they asked for my name I said David Morrison, the man who supposedly died in a car crash last week. There was a very long silence on the other end of the line before the officer said that prank calls about deceased individuals weren't funny and could result in charges, but I interrupted and told him I wasn't dead at all. I explained that he should check the mountain crash records and he'd find no body because I was never actually in that car, and my wife and her lover had tried to murder me, but I had extensive proof of everything they'd done. Another long silence followed before the officer asked if I could come down to the station immediately, and I said I'd be there within an hour, but I needed to call my lawyer first. I explained the entire situation to my lawyer and he was completely speechless for a solid minute before finally agreeing to meet me at the police station, warning me that this was about to get extremely complicated from a legal standpoint. I shaved off the fake beard and took off all the disguise elements so I looked like myself again, and then I drove to the police station in my rental car and walked through the front doors. The desk sergeant's face went completely white when she saw me standing there alive and well, and she stammered that I was supposed to be dead according to all their records. I smiled and told her that reports of my death had been greatly exaggerated, and I'd like to speak with a detective immediately about an attempted murder, specifically the attempted murder of me. The entire station erupted into absolute chaos with officers running around and making phone calls, and within 10 minutes I was sitting in an interview room with 2 senior detectives. I spent the next 3 hours telling them absolutely everything that had happened, starting from when I first suspected the affair all the way through to faking my death and recording Sarah and Mark's celebration. I showed them every single piece of evidence, including the photos and texts and videos, particularly the footage of Mark deliberately hitting my car and the audio of them toasting to getting away with murder. The detectives were completely stunned, and one of them said this was the most elaborate case he'd seen in his 20 years on the force, but I had everything they needed to build an airtight prosecution. They asked why I hadn't come forward sooner with my suspicions, and I told them the absolute truth without any sugarcoating. I needed to see how far they would actually go with their plan. I needed to know if my wife would genuinely celebrate my death, and I needed undeniable proof of not just the crime but the complete betrayal. They seemed to understand that sometimes you need absolute certainty, not just of criminal behavior but of the depths of someone's betrayal of your trust and love. That same night they arrested both Sarah and Mark in coordinated simultaneous raids at their homes. Sarah was in the middle of packing because she was getting ready to leave the country with her new fortune, and Mark was at his apartment probably planning their next moves. They both got charged with attempted murder, conspiracy to commit murder, insurance fraud, and financial fraud among other charges. The bail was set at $2 million each, and neither of them could possibly pay it because they'd already spent most of their available money preparing to flee, so now they were stuck in jail awaiting trial. I didn't visit either of them in jail because I had absolutely no desire to see them or hear their excuses and lies. My lawyer handled all the communication and legal proceedings while I focused on putting my life back together. The divorce papers were filed immediately and Sarah tried to contest it, claiming she still loved me and the affair was just a terrible mistake and she never actually wanted me dead. But we had crystal clear recordings of her saying otherwise, including her laughing about getting away with my murder, so the judge wasn't even slightly sympathetic to her claims. The trial took 6 long months to work through the legal system, and it was all over the news constantly, with headlines about the man who faked his death to catch his wife in an elaborate murder plot. Sarah's defense lawyer tried absolutely everything to get her off, claiming she was coerced by Mark or that he manipulated her or that all the text messages were taken out of context and didn't mean what they clearly said. But the jury wasn't buying any of it, especially not after they saw the video of Mark deliberately ramming my car off a cliff and heard the audio of Sarah laughing about getting away with murder. The verdict came back guilty on absolutely all counts for both of them, and Sarah was sentenced to 25 years in prison while Mark got 30 years because of his direct role in the actual murder attempt. On top of the prison time, they had to pay full restitution, including the $300,000 Sarah had stolen plus additional damages plus all court costs. They would spend decades behind bars and come out with absolutely nothing, while I still had my $8 million in my company and my freedom and my life, everything they had tried so desperately to take away from me. After the trial concluded, I did something I'd been planning for months while the legal proceedings dragged on. I started a charitable foundation called the David Morrison Second Chances Fund, specifically for people who'd survived attempted murder by their intimate partners. The foundation provides counseling and legal fees and security and everything victims need to rebuild their lives after that kind of trauma. I donated $2 million to get it started because I figured I should put my death and resurrection to some kind of good use that could help other people. My brother asked me one day how I was really doing beyond the surface level, and I told him the complete truth without holding anything back. I explained that I was angry and hurt and traumatized by everything that happened, but I was also alive and breathing, and that had to count for something. Some days just being alive felt like enough of an accomplishment given what I'd been through. He hugged me and said he was incredibly proud of me for surviving and fighting back and not letting them win, and I told him I really hadn't had any choice in the matter because when someone tries to kill you, you either fight back or you die, and I chose to fight. It's been 2 full years now since I supposedly died, since I attended my own funeral, since I sat in the back row and watched my wife celebrate my death with her lover. People constantly ask me if I've moved on with my life and if I've started dating anyone new, but I haven't done either of those things yet because I'm not ready and maybe I never will be. When someone you loved with your whole heart tries to murder you for money, it fundamentally changes something deep inside you that might never fully heal. Trust becomes completely impossible, love becomes absolutely terrifying, and you constantly wonder if anyone could ever really want you for who you are or if they're just quietly calculating your net worth and life insurance value. But I am slowly healing even if it doesn't always feel that way, and I see a therapist twice a week to work through all the trauma and betrayal. I've reconnected with old friends I'd lost touch with during my marriage, and I've even taken up hiking again, though I religiously avoid that particular mountain road because some scars run way too deep to ever fully fade. I built myself a completely new house and sold the one I'd shared with Sarah because there were too many ghosts there and too many memories of a life that was always just an elaborate lie. My new place is smaller and simpler, but it's entirely mine with nobody there but me, and that feels right for where I am now. Sometimes late at night I think about Sarah and wonder if she truly regrets what she did, though I suspect she doesn't regret the affair or the murder plot itself. She just regrets getting caught and having her perfect plan fall apart. I think what bothers her most is that I outsmarted her, that I saw through her performance, that I'm free and wealthy while she's rotting in prison for the next 2 decades. She writes me letters sometimes that get forwarded through my lawyer, but I don't read them because I genuinely don't care what she has to say anymore. She made her choice and now she has to live with the consequences. Mark stopped writing letters after the first year, and I guess he finally accepted that it was completely over and there was no point in continuing to reach out. All his appeals got systematically denied, his family disowned him completely, and he'll probably die in prison given his age and sentence length. I feel absolutely nothing about his fate, no satisfaction or desire for revenge, just a kind of emptiness where something used to be inside me. Maybe that emptiness is growth or maybe it's just permanent damage, but I honestly don't know anymore and I'm not sure it matters. The worst part of this entire experience isn't even the betrayal itself, and it isn't the fact that someone tried to murder me in cold blood. The worst part is knowing with absolute certainty that for years, probably for our entire marriage, Sarah never actually loved me at all. I was nothing more than a means to an end, a wallet with legs, an insurance policy that happened to be breathing. And when I became worth more dead than alive in her calculations, she didn't even hesitate for a moment. That's what keeps me awake at night, staring at the ceiling, not what she did but how easily and naturally she did it, like I was nothing and like 15 years of marriage meant absolutely nothing to her. But I survived when I wasn't supposed to, and that has to count for something in this world. I went to my own funeral and watched people mourn me and watched my wife celebrate my death with her lover, and then I came back from the dead stronger and smarter and harder than before. They tried to bury me 6 feet under, but they didn't know I'd already dug my way out, and now they're the ones buried under mountains of evidence and guilt and the crushing weight of their own evil choices. Would I do it all again if I could go back, fake my death and risk everything on this insane plan? Honestly, I don't know the answer to that question because it was incredibly dangerous and could have gone wrong in 100 different ways that would have left me actually dead. But it worked exactly as planned, and now I have the complete truth, not what I suspected or feared but absolute undeniable recorded truth about who these people really were. And sometimes having that truth is worth dying for, even if it's just a temporary death that you plan to come back from. My advice to anyone reading this or listening to this story is simple and direct. If you think your partner might be cheating on you, don't ignore those instincts and don't make excuses and don't hope it'll just go away on its own. Investigate thoroughly, get concrete proof, and protect yourself legally and financially, because if they'll betray you once, they'll absolutely do it again. And maybe next time you won't be lucky enough to see it coming like I barely was. If I hadn't installed that tracking app, if I hadn't hired Richard to investigate, if I just trusted my wife like a good husband is supposed to trust his spouse, I would be actually dead right now, not fake dead but really murdered and gone forever. Sarah would be living her absolute best life on my $8 million in Costa Rica with Mark, and nobody would ever know the truth about what they did. But that's not what happened in my story. What happened is that I won this twisted game. Not because I'm smarter than them or better than them, but simply because I refused to die quietly and refused to be just another victim and refused to let them win. So I faked my death convincingly, attended my own funeral in disguise, recorded everything they said and did, and brought them both to justice in the end. It's not a happy ending by any stretch of the imagination, because there are no happy endings when someone you love tries to murder you for money. But it is an ending where I'm alive and free and they're locked away where they can't hurt anyone else, and on my worst days that feels like enough. On my best days, that feels like absolutely everything I could have hoped for given the circumstances. Some days just surviving and winning is all you can ask for, and I'll take that over being dead any day of the week.